Guide to Disability Rights Law. This is from ADA.gov, the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Last updated February 28, 2020. This guide provides an overview of federal civil rights laws that ensure equal opportunity for people with disabilities. To find out more about these laws, how these laws may apply to you, contact the agencies and organizations listed below. American with Disabilities Act, ADA. The ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. It also applies to the United States Congress. To be protected by the ADA, one must have a disability, have a relationship or association with an individual with a disability. An individual with a disability is defined by the ADA as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. The ADA does not specifically name all the impairments that are covered. ADA Title I, Employment. Title I requires employers with 15 or more employees to provide qualified individuals with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from the full range of employment-related opportunities available to others. For example, it prohibits discrimination in recruitment, hiring, promotions, training, pay, social activities, and other privileges of employment. It restricts questions that can be asked about an applicant's disability before a job offer is made, and it requires that employers make reasonable accommodation to the known physical or mental limitations of otherwise qualified individuals with disabilities, unless it results in undue hardship. Religious entities of 15 or more employees are covered under Title I. Title I complaints must be filed with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, within 180 days of the date of discrimination, or 300 days if the charge is filed with a designated state or local Fair Employment Practice Agency. Individuals may file a lawsuit in federal court only after they receive a right to sue letter from the EEOC. Charges of employment discrimination on the basis of disability may be filed at any U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission field office. Field offices are located in 50 cities throughout the U.S. and are listed in most telephone directories under U.S. government. For the appropriate EEOC field office in your geographic area, contact 800-669-4000 for voice or 800-669-6820 and 844-234-5122-VP. That's at www.eeoc.gov. For information on how to accommodate a specific individual with a disability, contact the Job Accommodation Network at 800-526-7234 voice 877-781-9403 TTY. ADA Title II, State and Local Government Activities. Title II covers all activities of state and local governments, regardless of the government entity's size or receipt of federal funding. Title II requires that state and local governments give people with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from all of their programs, services, and activities, example, public education, employment, transportation, recreation, health care, social services, courts, voting, and town meetings. State and local governments are required to follow specific architectural standards in the new construction and alteration of their buildings. They also must relocate programs or otherwise provide access in inaccessible older buildings, and communicate effectively with people who are hearing, vision, or speech disabilities. Public entities are not required to take actions that will result in undue financial and administrative burdens. They are required to make reasonable modifications in policies, practice, and procedures where necessary to avoid discrimination unless they can demonstrate that doing so would fundamentally alter the nature of the service, program, or activity being provided. Complaints of Title II violations may be filed with the Department of Justice within 100 days of the date of discrimination. In certain situations, cases may be referred to a mediation program sponsored by the department. The department may bring a lawsuit where it has investigated a matter and has been unable to resolve violations. For more information, contact the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, 950 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest Disability Rights Section, Washington, D.C., 20530-800-514-0301, voice 833-610-1264, TTY. Title II may also be enforced under private lawsuits in federal court, and it's not necessary to file a complaint with the Department of Justice, DOJ, or any other federal agency to receive a right to sue letter before going to court. ADA Title II Public Transportation. The transportation provisions of Title II cover public transportation services such as city buses and public rail transit. Example, subways, commuter rails, Amtrak. Public transportation authorities may not discriminate against people with disabilities in the provision of their services. They must comply with requirements for accessibility in newly purchased vehicles and make good faith efforts to purchase or lease accessible used buses, remanufacture buses in an accessible manner, and unless it would result in an undue burden, provide paratransit where they operate fixed route bus or rail systems. Paratransit is a service where individuals who are unable to use the regular transit system independently because of a physical or mental impairment are picked up and dropped off at their destinations. Questions and complaints about public transportation should be directed to Office of Civil Rights, Federal Transit Administration, U.S. Department of Transportation, 1200 New Jersey Avenue, Southeast Washington, D.C., 20590. That's 888-446-4511 for voice relay. ADA Title III, Public Accommodations. Title III covers businesses and nonprofit service providers that are public accommodations, privately operated entities offering certain types of courses and examinations, privately operated transportation, and commercial facilities. Public accommodations are private entities who own, lease to, or operate private facilities such as restaurants, retail stores, hotels, movie theaters, private schools, convention centers, doctors' offices, homeless shelters, transportation depots, zoos, funeral homes, daycare centers, and recreation facilities, including sports stadiums and fitness clubs. Transportation services provided by private entities are also covered by Title III. Public accommodations must comply with basic non-discrimination requirements that prohibit exclusions, segregation, and unequal treatment. They also must comply with specific requirements related to architectural standards for new and altered buildings, reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures, effective communication with people with hearing, vision, or speech disabilities, and other access requirements. Additionally, public accommodations must remove barriers in existing buildings where it's easy to do so without much difficulty or expense, given the public accommodations resources. Courses and examinations related to professional, educational, or trade-related applications, licensing, certifications, or credentialing must be provided in a place and manner accessible to people with disabilities, or alternative accessible arrangements must be offered. Commercial facilities, such as factories and warehouses, must comply with the ADA's architectural standards for new construction and alterations. Complaints of Title III violations may be filed with the Department of Justice. In certain situations, cases may be referred to a mediation program sponsored by the department. The department is authorized to bring a lawsuit where there is a pattern or practice of discrimination in violation of Title III, or where an act of discrimination raises an issue of general public importance. Title III may also be enforced through private lawsuits. It is not necessary to file a complaint with the Department of Justice or any federal agency, or to receive a right to sue letter before going to court. For more information, contact the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, 950 Pennsylvania Avenue, NW Disability Rights Section, Washington, D.C. 20530. ADA Title IV, Telecommunications Relay Services. Title IV addresses telephone and television access for people with hearing and speech disabilities. It requires common carriers, telephone companies, to establish interstate and intrastate telecommunications relay services, TRS, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. TRS enables callers with hearing and speech disabilities who use TTYs, also known as TDDs, and callers who use voice telephones to communicate with each other through a third-party communications assistant. The Federal Communications Commission, FCC, has set minimum standards for TRS services. Title IV also requires closed captioning of federally funded public service announcements. For more information about TRS, contact the FCC at Federal Communications Commission, 445 12th Street Southwest, Washington, D.C., 20554, 888-225-5322, voice 888-835-5322, TTY. Telecommunications Act. Section 255 and Section 251A2 of the Communications Act of 1934 is amended by the Telecommunications Act of 1996, require manufacturers of telecommunications equipment and providers of telecommunications services to ensure that such equipment and services are accessible to and usable by persons with disabilities, if readily achievable. These amendments ensure that people with disabilities will have access to a broad range of products and services such as telephones, cell phones, pagers, call waiting, and operator services that were often inaccessible to many users with disabilities. For more information, contact the Federal Communications Commission, 445 12th Street Southwest, Washington, D.C., 20554. That's 888-225-5322, voice 888-835-5322, TY. Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act, as amended in 1988, prohibits housing discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, and national origin. Coverage includes private housing, housing that receives federal financial assistance, and state and local government housing. It is unlawful to discriminate in any aspect of selling or renting housing or to deny a dwelling to a buyer or renter because of the disability of that individual, an individual associated with the buyer or renter, or an individual who intends to live in the residence. Other covered activities include, for example, financing, zoning practices, new construction design, and advertising. The Fair Housing Act requires owners of housing facilities to make reasonable exceptions in their policies and operations to afford people with disabilities equal housing opportunities. For example, a landlord with a no pets policy may be required to grant an exception to this rule and allow an individual who is blind to keep a guide dog in the residence. The Fair Housing Act also requires landlords to allow tenants with disabilities to make reasonable access-related modifications to their private living space, as well as to common use space. The landlord is not required to pay for the changes. The Act further requires that new multifamily housing with 4 or more units be designed and built to allow access for persons with disabilities. This includes accessible common use areas, doors that are wide enough for wheelchairs, kitchens and bathrooms that allow for a person using a wheelchair to maneuver, and other adaptable features within the units. Complaints of Fair Housing Act violations may be filed with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. For more information or to file a complaint, contact the Office of Compliance and Disability Rights Division, Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, 451 7th Street Southwest, Room 5242, Washington, D.C. 20410. That's 800-669-9777, voice 800-927-9275, TTY. And that's at www.ADA.gov/program offices/fair housing equal op/disability Maine. For questions about the accessibility provisions of the Fair Housing Act, contact the Fair Housing Accessibility First at 888-341-7781, voice TTY. For publications, you may call the Housing and Urban Development Customer Service Center at 800-767-7468, voice relay. Additionally, the Department of Justice can file cases involving a pattern or practice of discrimination. The Fair Housing Act may also be enforced through private lawsuits. Air Carrier Access Act. The Air Carrier Access Act prohibits discrimination in air transportation by domestic and foreign air carriers against qualified individuals with physical or mental impairments. It applies only to air carriers that provide regular scheduled services for hire to the public. Requirements address a wide range of issues, including boarding assistance and certain accessibility, features in newly built aircraft, and new or altered airport facilities. People may enforce rights under the Air Carrier Access Act by filing a complaint with the U.S. Department of Transportation or by bringing a lawsuit in federal court. For more information or to file a complaint, contact the Aviation Consumer Protection Division, C-75, U.S. Department of Transportation, 1200 New Jersey Avenue, Southeast, Washington, D.C., 20590. Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act. The Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act of 1984 generally requires polling places across the United States to be physically accessible to people with disabilities for federal elections. Where no accessible location is available to serve as a polling place, a political subdivision must provide an alternate means of casting a ballot on the day of election. The law also requires states to make available registration and voting aids for disabled and elderly voters, including information by TTYs or similar services. For more information, contact the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, 950 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest Voting Section, 4C0ON, 8th floor, Washington, D.C., 20530, and that's at 800-253-3931, voice or TTY. National Voter Registration Act. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993, also known as the Motor Voter Act, makes it easier for all Americans to exercise their fundamental right to vote. One of the basic purposes of the act is to increase the historically low registration rates of minorities and persons with disabilities that have resulted from discrimination. The Motor Voter Act requires all offices of state-funded programs that are primarily engaged in providing services to persons with disabilities to provide all program applicants with voter registration forms, to assist them in completing the forms, and to transmit completed forms to the appropriate state official. For more information, contact the U.S. Department of Civil Rights, Division 950 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest Voting Section 4C09N 8th Avenue, Florida, Washington, D.C. 20530, and that's at 800-253-3931. Civil Rights of Institutional Persons Act. The Civil Rights of Institutional Persons Act, CRIPA, authorizes the U.S. Attorney General to investigate conditions of confinement at state and local government institutions such as prisons, jails, pretrial detention centers, juvenile correctional facilities, publicly operated nursing homes, and institutions for people with psychiatric or developmental disabilities. Its purpose is to allow the Attorney General to uncover and correct widespread deficiencies that seriously jeopardize the health and safety of residents of institutions. The Attorney General does not have the authority under CRIPA to investigate isolated incidents or to represent individual institutionalized persons. The Attorney General may initiate civil lawsuits where there is a reasonable cause to believe that conditions are egregious or flagrant, that they are subjecting residents to grievous harm, and that they are part of a pattern or practice of resistance to residents' full enjoyment of constitutional or federal rights, including Title II of the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. For more information or to bring a matter to the Department of Justice's attention, contact the U.S. Department of Civil Rights Division, 950 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest Special Litigation Section, Washington, D.C. 20530. That's 877-218-5223. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, formerly called PL 94-142, or the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, requires public schools to make available to all eligible children with disabilities a free, appropriate public education at the least restrictive environment appropriate to their individual needs. IDEA requires public school systems to develop appropriate individualized education programs, IEPs, for each child. The specific special education and related services outlined in the IEP reflect the individualized needs of each student. IDEA also mandates that particular procedures be followed in the development of the IEP. Each student's IEP must be developed by a team of knowledgeable persons and must be at least reviewed annually. The team includes the child's teacher, the parents, subject to certain limited exceptions, the child, if determined appropriate, an agency representative who is qualified to provide or supervise the provision of special education, and other individuals at the parents' or agency's discretion. If parents disagree with the proposed IEP, they can request a due process hearing and a review from the state educational agency if applicable in that state. They also can appeal the state agency's decision to state or federal court. For more information, contact Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, U.S., Department of Education, 400 Maryland Avenue, Southwest, Washington, D.C. 20202-7100, and that's at 202-245-7459. Rehabilitation Act. The Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies. In programs receiving federal financial assistance, in federal employment, and in the employment practices of federal contractors. The standards for determining employment discrimination under the Rehabilitation Act are the same as those used in Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Section 501. Section 501 requires affirmative action and non-discrimination in employment by federal agencies of the executive branch. To obtain more information or to file a complaint, employees should contact their agency's Equal Employment Opportunity Office. Section 503. Section 503 requires affirmative action and prohibits employment discrimination by federal government contractors and subcontractors with contracts of more than $10,000. And for more information on Section 503, contact the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, U.S. Department of Labor, 200 Constitution Avenue, Northwest Washington, D.C., 20210, 800-397-6251. Voice is 877-889-5627-TTY. Section 504. Section 504 states that no qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall be excluded from, denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that either receives federal financial assistance or is conducted by any executive agency or the United States Postal Service. Each federal agency has its own set of Section 504 regulations that apply to its own programs. Agencies that provide federal financial assistance also have Section 504 regulations covering entities that receive federal aid. Requirements common to these regulations include reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities, program accessibility, effective communication with people who have hearing or vision disabilities, and accessible new construction and alterations. Each agency is responsible for enforcing its own regulations. Section 504 may also be enforced through private lawsuits. It is not necessary to file a complaint with the federal agency or to receive a right to sue letter before going to court. For information on how to file 504 complaints with the appropriate agency, contact the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, 950 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest Disability Rights Section, Washington, D.C., 20530, and that's at 800-514-0301 voice or 1-833-610-1264 TTY. Section 508. Section 508 establishes requirements for electronic and information technology developed, maintained, procured, and used by the federal government. Section 508 requires federal electronic and information technology to be accessible to people with disabilities, including employees and members of the public. An accessible information technology system is one that can be operated in a variety of ways and does not rely on a single sense or ability of the user. For example, a system that provides output only in visual format may not be accessible to people with visual impairments, and a system that provides output only in audio format may not be accessible to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Some individuals with disabilities may need accessibility-related software or peripheral devices in order to use systems that comply with Section 508. For more information on Section 508, contact the U.S. General Services Administration Office of Enterprise Planning and Governance, or the U.S. Architectural and Transportation Barriers Compliance Board. Architectural Barriers Act. The Architectural Barriers Act, ABA, requires that buildings and facilities that are designed, constructed, or altered with federal funds be leased by a federal agency comply with federal standards for physical accessibility. ABA requirements are limited to architectural standards in new and altered buildings and in newly leased facilities. They do not address the activities conducted in those buildings and facilities of the U.S. Postal Service are covered by the ABA. For more information or to file a complaint, contact the U.S. Architectural and Transportation Barriers Compliance Board. That's at www.access-board.gov. General sources of disability rights information. We have the ADA information line, and that is at 800-514-0301 voice, and that is 1-833-610-1264 TTY, and that is at ADA.gov. We also have the ADA National Network. That is at 800-949-4232. Voice TTY, and that's also at www.adata.org.